Welcome to another episode of Legitimate Matters. This conversation today is so important. We're going to be talking about the Alzheimer's disease crisis, specifically in the African American community. I'm so happy today to welcome my guest, Dr. Christiane Reitz, who is the Assistant Professor of Neurology and Epidemiology in the Taub Institute at Columbia University Medical Center in New York City. Dr. Reitz, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for the invitation, William. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm so glad that you're here. You and I have had several conversations, and we've talked about this crisis. And for my viewers, as we begin, can you just tell us what are the statistics with African Americans and Alzheimer's disease, and how really serious is this?
So Alzheimer's disease is really one of the public health crises worldwide. So it really affects people on all continents, people of all ethnic groups. In general, about the risk increases by age.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you look at people at the age of 60, there are about 10% of seniors affected, but it significantly increases with age. And then if you look at people over the age of 80 or 85, you have almost two-thirds of seniors affected.
Wow.
So it really is a public health crisis across the board in all ethnic groups.
Two-thirds is a really
It's
big
a big
number.
issue. It's really, yeah.
And it's
So
increasing.
It's increasing because the society is getting older.
Wow.
People survive longer because other diseases like heart disease or cancers are we're able to treat them better, so people survive longer, and that's why more and more people now are getting Alzheimer's disease.
Well, is there a difference, or this show is really about raising awareness specifically with African Americans, and but how does those numbers compare to Hispanics versus whites, and why is this something that African Americans and Hispanics in particular should really pay more attention to?
So African Americans have twice the risk of Alzheimer's disease compared to whites, and also the risk is a little bit higher compared to Hispanics. So Hispanics have about 1.5 the risk of whites, and African Americans have actually twice the risk of Alzheimer's disease compared to whites. So it really is particularly a particular concern in the African American communities. The reason why that is the case is something we really need to find out. We probably have some idea. We know that, for example, African Americans have higher frequency of what we call vascular disease, which is diabetes, hypertension, high cholesterol, heart disease, and stroke. And we know that all these are increasing the risk of Alzheimer's disease. So because these risk factors are more frequent in African Americans, that probably is part of the explanation why also the risk of Alzheimer's disease is particularly high in African Americans. But that is not, it's clear that that's not the full answer to that. And we need to find out all the other risk factors which increase the risk of Alzheimer's disease in African Americans, so that we can really fully explain this extensive risk African Americans have.
Is it more prone to men versus women, or vice versa? Does it affect women more?
It does affect women more, and that is the case in all ethnic groups. And that's another big area of research right now, to see if it's, what the reasons for that are, if it's something genetic, which is specifically to women, or, for example, if it's related to hormones, which might be a difference. And that's something we don't have the answer yet, but there's a lot of research going on to understand this. Two-thirds are women, one-third are men.
Wow, 2/3.
Yes.
So
that's really a big difference.
So we're saying 2/3 are women, which is alarming.
Yeah.
And we're also saying that we're also saying 2/3, if I caught that right, of African Americans. Did I catch that right?
2/3 are women. So of the people who have Alzheimer's disease, 2/3 are women, 1/3 are men. In terms of African Americans compared to other groups, African Americans have twice the risk compared to whites to develop Alzheimer's disease.
So that's, to me, I consider those numbers to be alarming. Very alarming, and even more alarming than the statistics of African Americans being affected by this disease is the lack of participation in the research, which is just shocking and unfortunate. Tell us more about that.
Yes. So, so what we know is that also because we see the differences in risk between the different ethnic groups, there must clearly differences in risk factors,
sure,
or differences in reasons why African Americans are so immensely affected. And because of that, it's extremely important to do the research we're doing, research on Alzheimer's disease reasons in the different ethnic groups separately. So there's been a lot of studies going on in whites. There's been more and more studies going on in Hispanics, but there's a significant lack of research in African Americans. But it's crucial that we do research specifically in African Americans and separately in order to really understand what the mechanisms are which lead to this high risk of Alzheimer's disease in African Americans. And I think an important point to understand is that you cannot just take findings from research in whites or in Hispanics and just extrapolate them to the African American community.
It has to be specific.
It has to be specific. And one of the reasons is that we believe that genetic risk factors play a role.
Okay.
And you know, the DNA and the way the DNA is made up and the genes are made up, there are differences between ethnic group. I'm not going to go into that because it's very difficult to explain
sure,
that. But because of these differences in the genes between ethnic groups, it's extremely important to do especially genetic research separately by ethnic group. And there's a significant lack, unfortunately, of African American participants in the studies.
Wow, so we really
it's very hard. It's important that this participation increases in order to really serve the African American community well.
Well, one of the first takeaways in this show is to really hit home the importance of if you're African American or even Hispanic, okay, it's so important that you do your homework and you do your research and about getting involved. Become part of the research for Alzheimer's disease because it's your community that is being affected most by this just devastating disease. We're going to go to break, but when we come back from break, we're going to talk more about the differences between Alzheimer's disease versus dementia or vice versa, and find out more about the causes. So stay with us. This is such an important show. We want you to really take away important information that will be which will have such a positive impact on your life and the life of your family. We'll be right back. This is William Parris, Legitimate Matters. Welcome back to Legitimate Matters. We're having a great conversation with my guest today, Dr. Christiane Reitz, who is the Assistant Professor of Neurology and Epidemiology in the Taub Institute at Columbia University Medical Center in New York City. Dr. Reitz, we were talking about these statistics in the first segment, but there's sometimes confusion when people hear the word Alzheimer's. They interchange dementia with Alzheimer's. What is the difference?
Yeah, I think that is really something which is very confusing to people in general, and that's a question I get very often. Dementia is, something like an umbrella term. So if you imagine somebody standing there like with an umbrella, this umbrella itself is dementia, just simply a term for problems with your memory.
I see.
It just simply means like cognitive impairment, memory impairment. But there are different causes of dementia. So imagine there are like 4 people standing under this umbrella.
Okay.
The umbrella itself is the memory impairment, but there are several reasons for that, several causes of that. One, for example, is Alzheimer's disease is simply the most frequent cause of dementia. A second cause of dementia is, for example, Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease can lead to dementia, to memory problems. Then, for example, stroke. People can have, in the aftermath of stroke, can develop memory impairment, dementia. And then there are different other causes. For example, HIV can lead also to memory issues and so on. So dementia is the overall umbrella term for memory impairment, and then there are different causes of dementia. The most frequent cause is Alzheimer's disease.
I see. Wow. And when a person, when I hear that, it's kind of scary because when we get older, we sometimes are not as sharp, or we feel that we are not as sharp. I have friends, and we kind of joke about it all the time, but we don't necessarily consider it to be a part of early signs of anything. We immediately associate that with aging.
Yes.
So but what I hear is that in many instances, it's not a natural part of aging. Right. In fact, it could be early signs of something. So tell us, what should we look for?
So I think that's a very important point, William, because I think that's something where we really need to increase the recognition in the population that developing memory problems might actually not be a normal part of aging. So we differentiate between that. It is normal that memory gets worse a little bit as you age. That's completely normal. Where really the difference is by how much, and what are really the specific symptoms.
Okay.
There are a couple of symptoms really to watch out for in order to really see if maybe there's something going on you should have checked out by your doctor. So early signs of Alzheimer's disease are in particular problems with your memory and your short-term memory. So for example, if you always went to the store to do your grocery shopping and you never needed a list for, writing down the items, but you were always able to remember them. And that changes. For example, you realize that you go to the store and you really forget many of the things you wanted to buy. And suddenly you need a list for buying your groceries. Or for example, that you forget names of your family members, your brother, your son, or best friends' names, or for example birthdays, birthdays which are really close to your heart. You always knew them all your life, and suddenly you forget these things. And if these kind of things increase, these kind of memory problems, then that might be of concern. Then there are additional symptoms. For example, really misplacing things. That's something which happens very often. So, for example, I think everybody sometimes misplaces things. You misplace your keys or something like that. That happens to everybody.
Right.
But often, with people with Alzheimer's disease, these things also happen are misplaced in very strange locations. For example, that somebody might put like their wallet into the fridge or something like that, which really would be unusual.
That would be unusual, but would that be a little bit more advanced? What about something, if it's, honestly, there have been people that have asked me on Monday or Tuesday, how was your weekend? And I have to stop and think, I don't remember what I did on Saturday.
Yes.
So, and I have to really stop and put time into that. What did I do on Saturday?
That's very normal.
That's normal?
Right, so that's normal. I think that happens to everybody. It also depends a little bit on, like really where you, it's often like a concentration issue, or also, people's lives are sometimes so stressful, they have so many things to think about that, your brain also has like a specific amount of capacity, right? So that if there's so many things you have to organize in your life, it's normal to forget a few things, or whatever. If somebody asks you what did you do, it takes a little bit longer to think about. But the important thing is that at some point you remember. Right. People with Alzheimer's disease will not remember. It's not that like after a minute or two they say, oh yeah, now I remember what I did.
Or if you forget how to spell a word that is so easy to you, but now you're, or in the middle of a conversation, because it has happened to me, I can be in the middle of a conversation and suddenly I forgot what I was talking about. Well, that could just be my scattered brain. Don't judge. So, but what I'm hearing is not necessarily cause for alarm, but certainly if there are things that you forget and you don't remember them, or if you do things that are completely out of the ordinary in terms of memory or misplacing.
And also the important thing is also one differentiation as to if it changed. Like if, for example, today you would forget what you did maybe last weekend, but this is only today because you're really busy today. You have so much things on your brain to think about, but usually that's not the case. And maybe like in the, in the future, next week it's different. I ask you next week and you remember. It really is of concern if it's a consistent change compared to before.
Wonderful.
And that's really where the differentiation is. So if your memory, if you realize that your mother's or father's or friend's memory really changed and you see a consistent change, it's not a one-time thing, but it's really consistent change, and it keeps getting gradually worse, then that's something to be concerned about. And then there are additional signs we can look out for. For example,
we're going to go to break.
Okay,
we're going to go to break, and then we're going to finish that, and we're going to talk about how people can get help.
Sounds good.
Okay. So listen, this is such a great conversation. I could talk about this for a good hours because there's so much to talk about. But stay with us. William Parris, Legitimate Matters. We will be right back.
I'm B. Smith, and I suffer from Alzheimer's disease. Brain disease affects millions. Unfortunately, minorities are underrepresented in research, so we may not be getting the best possible care. The Brain Health Registry collects vital information online for free, so please tell your story. I'm telling mine. Help find cures faster by visiting brainhealthregistry.org.
Welcome back to Legitimate Matters. This is your host, William Parris. I'm here today speaking with Dr. Christiane Reitz, who is the Assistant Professor of Neurology and Epidemiology in the Taub Institute at Columbia University in New York City. Dr. Reitz, in our last conversation, we were talking about the signs and things that we might want to really pay attention to. Tell us a little more about that.
Yeah, so in addition to problems with your memory, what happens also often is that people have problems with orientation to time. For example, that they wouldn't know what day it is today or what the day of the week is, but also orientation in their neighborhood and, what we call geographic, orientation in space, basically. So, for example, that they get lost.
Oh, wow.
That they get lost in the neighborhood they live for, for 30 years. Or even around their house. Then also, for example, problems with, calculations, they were always able to pay their bills and are suddenly not able to do simple calculations anymore. So these kind of things, if that changed, that might be a matter of concern.
And what about the funding? Tell us about that, because with this being such a crisis, are we getting enough funding to really help with the research and the studies?
So that's a very important point, because obviously without enough funding, it's very hard to do research and find the causes of Alzheimer's disease and eventually effective treatments. So that's been a concern for a long time. The governments in the US, but also around the world, have understood that Alzheimer's disease is a public health crisis. So in terms of the funding for Alzheimer's disease, we are doing a little bit better than research in many other diseases because the government has understood that, but there's clearly still not enough funding. So it's very important to really advocate for that, do your homework, and really also take to the streets and really, go participate in demonstrations for increasing funding, because it is not enough.
Okay, so our viewers, my viewers really need to get involved, because and become a part of the research also,
Yes.
because the more people now this is a guess, that the more participants you have in the research, then that justifies the need for more funding. Is that an accurate statement, or one has nothing to do with the other?
It's it's accurate. So one thing is we need increased funding. There's no question about
Right.
that. The more funding we get, the more funding the NIH puts out there for Alzheimer's disease research, the more studies can be done. And the more likely we are to find the causes and potential treatments.
And it's better to
that
have
of course increases with the number of studies which are being done by good research groups. But still, also we cannot do studies without participants.
And
we
need
need
families,
money,
and you need families.
we need the budget,
Right.
we need the funding. And we need the participants, and that's incredible. So to really get the word out there and explain to people how important it is to get involved in research and participate is extremely critical for us.
What about public health campaigns? Is there enough of that going on? I don't feel that, I don't hear it enough. What about the churches and the colleges? Do you feel that there's enough participation from you look on every other corner in New York, whether you're especially in Brooklyn and Manhattan,
Yes.
so many churches who have this influence
Yes.
on the
Yes.
community. What about them?
I think there's no question that that there's a clear interest and a clear need for participation of the communities and the churches and so on. I think what's missing a little bit is the own initiative.
Okay.
I think really especially the churches, because the African American community is so integrated with the churches and also trust the church leaders so much. I think it's critical that the churches get involved and in, for example, information events about Alzheimer's disease, which also provides people with critical information they need about the disease, how they could get involved, the research studies which are being done, how they could get involved in that. I think it's critical that there's more effort also from the community itself to tackle this disease.
Wonderful. Well, I believe that there's a lot to be done. We're talking about getting involved. We're talking about churches having advertisement, and even here in New York, I believe that your research department will go to the churches and speak, so they can reach out to you in the college. I'm sorry, in the hospital, and there's also places that they can go in order to just do their own homework. What I think that the important takeaways from this show is that African American, the African Americans, and I want to just continue to also include Hispanics in this.
Yes.
Really need to pay more attention to this. Take the time to go online and read up on these statistics on your own. Also, be the one that initiates the programs in your church or in your community to get the awareness out.
Yes.
Also, speak to members of your family.
Yes.
And become a part of the
Yes.
research.
Yes.
Because if you pretend that it doesn't exist, you'll
Yes.
find that
Yes.
you are becoming your own victim.
Yes. Yes.
And so these are the kinds of things that I want my viewers to take away. And do you have any last thoughts before we close the show?
I think also what is important is, there's also, that's in all ethnic groups the case. There's a little bit less participation from men than from women.
Less participation from men.
So it's very important that also that we also have the men from our communities really participate in research more than it is right now. So that's I think an important point to make too.
Wonderful.
And there's a lot of research studies going on in African Americans. There are large-scale studies going on, and they all look for participants. And it's extremely important that you participate in these research studies, because otherwise, it's very difficult to find a cure.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Reitz, thank you so much for being on the show.
My
Thank
pleasure.
you so much for sharing such important information. And if you would like to know more about Alzheimer's disease and what you can do to become involved in the research, don't turn off the TV, but watch the end of my show, and during the credits I'm going to list more information about where you can find out where to go, how you can participate in the studies, and just information in general. I always appreciate you watching the show. I'm William Parris, your host on Legitimate Matters. As always, thank you for watching.